Fab. There we are. So, as we said, it's been lovely to hear about the different roles, the different motivations from all of you, because I think it's a bit of a broad brush, this idea of being trauma responsive or trauma informed or trauma sensitive or trauma aware. There's so many different kind of interpretations. And I guess from the outset, it feels important to say we're really aware that the idea of being trauma informed or trauma informed approaches, I think, has started to feel like a bit of a buzzword. I think some of that has taken different forms, like it's felt more like training or workforce development. And whilst all those things are really valuable, we wanted to think about something that was more aligned with like community-based offers. So, and that for me felt a lot more around creating more accessibility, more inclusive and understanding organisations that were able to avoid as much as possible re-triggering trauma to enable people to be a part of their offer, but also support people to heal because it doesn't need to be therapy to be therapeutic. And I think a lot of people have an offer way beyond what perhaps the primary task of their organisation is. And it kind of feels important to recognise that in terms of why we're here. This isn't beyond barriers coming in as expert and suggesting we're going to train everyone up to be trauma informed practitioners. We're in this with you. We just happen to be holding the structure around it and have had a bit more background to get to this point. And it feels really important to recognise that the reason why you guys have been invited, and some of that was your connections to the Mental Health Collaborative, was actually because we recognised as a group that you're already doing really important work really well, and this project isn't necessarily about making huge changes in that. It's about recognising the strengths that are already there and creating a safe, respectful space to be able to reflect on how, I guess, the areas that we could find opportunities to become even safer, even more accessible, even more responsive to trauma. So it's not an appraisal, it's not an assessment, but it is kind of taking seriously the need to gently and compassionately hold ourselves to account for what we say we do. And that's the hope by the end of this. I'm going to, at any point, if anyone wants to just chip in, feel free. Don't worry about putting your hand up or waiting for me to see your little yellow hand. We can keep this conversational if you want to. But I'm going to rattle through these slides to make sure we've got plenty of time at the end to sort of explore it a bit more. I thought it was probably really important to give some context as well. So this started, certainly for me and for Beyond Barriers, probably not long after COVID began. And I recognised that, we developed LifeBeat and that was, working really well for people. But I knew that even after 18 months of quite intensive group work, a lot of people still wouldn't finish and walk into that gardening group or join that gym or kind of integrate the things that we needed them to start living more wholeheartedly after they'd started to manage the impact of their trauma. And that's where I sort of started to have this idea of like, well, actually, what if what's needed is a broader way to hold trauma in mainstream spaces? And so I started back then to talk about the idea of like therapeutic towns and how we could think about trauma without calling it trauma. And if I'm honest, back in 2020, I think people probably had different priorities, and at time people just didn't get it. I used to talk about this idea of therapeutic towns with funders, and look at me like I've got two heads sometimes. But actually, not long after that, things started to move at a GM level, and the what is now trauma responsive GM program started to evolve, and we got some funding to do the pilot program. So we worked with 6 local VCFSE organisations in Trafford to start to develop what we considered to be back then what we were calling a trauma sensitive communities program. So how do we create more trauma sensitivity within our communities? and it went really well. It was great. We had a really nice opportunity to do plenty of consultation. We mapped out different levels of trauma sensitivity across the borough. We went through quite an extended shared learning process, so we were really keen that we would sort of organically co-produce the learning offer. So whilst I brought some bits, other people brought others, and we sort of started to collate that together into what is now the workshops. We focused quite a lot on how we translated that into culture change. And back then, we were also lucky enough to have some grant funding from Trafford Housing Trust to offer alongside this the staff support programmes. Because I think from our perspective, it doesn't feel comfortable or aligned with our values to ask staff to move towards trauma if we don't equip them with the opportunity to manage the emotional impact of doing that. Um, so that's kind of where we got to. And it went quiet for a little while. The sort of network was rumbling in the background, and then the Mental Health Collaborative kind of was formed, and an opportunity came up again then to think about how we might use some of the funding that was available to expand this approach to our culture within the Trafford VCSE sector. And that's, yes. Yeah, I think there was about six. So there were all VCFSE organisations apart from one who was Full Circle Funeral Partners in Altrincham, who were this amazing. You'd call them a social business. Like they are at the heart of their offer is about creating environments that are much more aligned with bereavement services as it is just. And so they used it really well in terms of the pledges that they made, which we'll talk about the pledges. But the rest were, I think we had String of Hearts, we had, I want to say, out there. Yeah, yeah. Blue Sky came for a little bit, but then I think priorities, I think just demand outstripped capacity, and they couldn't finish the program. And then who else came? Gosh, I should know this. Oh, Calm Connections that was back then, and a couple of others. So it was, yeah, it was a small group. Is that what you were wondering about? Like who? Yeah, I mean, it went out in newsletters. I think back then it was we didn't have much scope for translating it, and because it was a pilot project, we thought, well, we'll do what we can with what we got. Uh, okay. Yeah, absolutely. So it's been around in the background probably during the time that you've been in the collective, and I guess this is where we've got to now. What I would say is that going forward, we do make some assumptions about trauma that I think aren't particularly misaligned with how the community sector approaches trauma. It can be different, perhaps, to how more traditional statutory organisations approach trauma. It can be different to how maybe people who've had contact with psychiatric services might consider trauma. But we talk about trauma as something that it's not necessarily about what happens. It's not the events necessarily. It's about what happens inside of you as a result of them. And I think we actively challenge over medicalisation of emotional distress and trauma. And the whole narrative, I guess, is about moving it more towards like it's not about what's wrong with you. It's not about a disorder. It's about what's happened to you or not happened to you that should have done for some people. And I like this little picture of the little one on the bottom right corner, the idea that when little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not join their chaos. And I think the relevance that I felt in the work that we do is that so often the person that we are seeing in front of us is actually a little person that's been activated, in those moments where they really need trauma sensitive responses, trauma responses that are understanding is when sometimes very old parts of them are running the show, really traumatized parts of them. Sorry, Laurie, were you going to? Oh, Well, interestingly, I do quite a bit of work with GM probation now, and yeah, and they're not necessarily like so. Occasionally, we will do one specifically around trauma informed practice, but a lot of the work that we do are within. They have like monthly reflective practice now, and so my section of that is about helping them support the sort of impact of vicarious trauma and burnout. So within those conversations, we inevitably start to talk about the person at the bottom because there's a lot of power. I mean, it's relevant to this because I think it can be relevant in all sorts of organisations, but the criminal justice sector particularly, the role of power is so embedded at every level, whether it was from the very start when someone had power taken away from them or had power over them and they went down a path that was socially unacceptable and ended up in the criminal justice system, or top down, you know, the authority and power is like the MO. That's their primary task, isn't it? They achieve their primary task by restriction and removing liberty and things. So I think there's definitely more conversations around that. But some of the work that we've done more broadly with probation and the police has been to have conversations like when you've got a 25-year-old lad kicking off in a cell and you're trying to negotiate with him through a letterbox. Actually, what is going on in that cell could well be a 5-year-old boy being locked in a cupboard. Yeah. And what he's responding to at that point is very much relational trauma rather than so supporting people to get more understanding around how trauma shows up in their working life was a big part of what this could be about if we want it to be. Definitely. So I think that's a really, really helpful point, and hopefully some of this will feel aligned with your ambitions as well, Laura. If that's okay. Does that answer your question? Okay. Um, so why would we want a trauma responsive Trafford? Well, good point. I think there are several reasons. I would say, and I know I'm a bit biased, but we have a broader remit other than just trauma. But even so, adversity and trauma affect a significant percentage of the population. We know that. I think a large amount of mental health problems are explained by something that has overwhelmed someone's sense of safety to a point that their attempts to cope with it leads to mental health difficulties. It's also the unseen impact. Like not all trauma is obvious, and a lot of people don't identify with the idea of trauma. A lot of people might not necessarily recognise the traumatic effect of what was absent, like not enough protection, like the absence of love, acceptance, support, all of those things can leave someone terrified of being overwhelmed and in their life. So there's a lot of unseen impact, and I think particularly within some areas of Trafford, we sit in South Trafford, we sit in Altrincham. I sometimes think it's quite hard to get people to connect with that because of they have an awareness of their privilege, and sometimes privilege impacts the ability to recognise trauma. Like, what have I got to be upset about? Type conversations that we often have with people. Um, when hurt happens within relationships, we need healthy relationships in which to heal, and that doesn't have to be therapy. You don't have to see a therapist to experience something therapeutic that can heal. And I suppose importantly now, in this version of the project, it feels quite important that Trafford is aligned with the broader trauma responsive GM initiatives than Concorda, which is really, really gaining momentum and following. Anybody else have any thoughts about why we would want a trauma responsive Trafford? Just a borough wide sort of idea for the sector, particularly. It's okay if you don't. No, okay. Well, hold that in mind, and we'll come back to it. And I might ask you again by the end of the session. So, we, as part of if I can flick back. I don't know whether you can see the network development. You can. Oh, sorry, how do you go? It's okay. Don't worry. Go on. I think your connection's a little bit. Oh, Addy, I don't think we can hear you. I think everyone's listening really intently to try and pick up what's happened, but I think we're only getting snippets. Would you be able to put it in the chat and we can read out there, or Grace can read it out for us? Is that all right? Sorry, there's no. Tell you what, I'm putting lots of pressure on you to type really fast now. Put it in the chat and we'll come back to it when you've had time to type it out. Is that okay? Can anybody else hear Addy, or is it? No. Oh no. Okay. Right. Yeah. Just put it in the chat, and we'll get to it when you've had time to put it down. It sounded important. So, okay. Um, so one thing that we felt important was is as in any sort of community project is consultation, and so we asked people what they thought about what they needed and some of the challenges, and I think these were one of the major drivers for me. Things like I haven't been to the dentist in 20 years. I can't stand the thought of lying underneath someone and not being able to leave. I get really worked up if I can't let someone know when I've got concerns. When something gets cancelled, it triggers old stuff. Then I don't go back in case they don't want me. Going to a new shop or service or class on my own is a really scary process for me, and I frequently sign up for things I'd like to do and see and don't follow through because of my anxiety. Unless someone's obviously friendly, I'll assume they don't like me. And if they're late, it gets even worse. That's a really big bias, isn't it, for people who've been through relational trauma? I get really uncomfortable when there's no windows. It makes me feel trapped. Then it all starts to feel unsafe. If there aren't obvious signs like a pride or trans flag, it doesn't feel as friendly. I might not go in. I'm terrified the receptionist is going to say something about me in the waiting room. Waiting rooms are a nightmare. So this was just a sort of flavour of the feedback that we got when we asked people of the challenges of engaging with groups in their local community. So we also asked like what would make it better. So we asked when you're feeling vulnerable, anxious, low, frightened, overwhelmed, what would make a difference? What would you need for you to feel safe and secure enough to attend? And interestingly, people's responses from the focus groups that we did tended to acknowledge that there were three sort of areas of this. There were the services, probably a bit more statutory sector or professional services like solicitors and dentists. There was the high street, so shops, hairdressers, gyms, um, yoga, beauty therapists, banks. People really struggled with banks, which is really interesting. And community organisations like ours, like voluntary groups and clubs, walking groups. There were, even within the community sector, which often carries quite a high level of lived experience, there were still blocks in being able to engage safely for them, meaningfully. And I don't know whether you can see behind my face, but the things that they talked about tended to map on to three areas that we were already thinking about. It was about the buildings. How safe and welcoming does their space feel? Is it triggering? The people, is their manner helpful or is that triggering? And in their words, the rules and regulations, we would probably call that governance and leadership, but the rules and regulations, is the way they operate helpful? Does it make you feel secure or can it be triggering? Um, does any of that kind of surprise you, or does it feel expected in terms of what you think people might have suggested and brought up as a topic? Absolutely, and I think there is always the balance, and it has been said to me a couple of times. Grace and I were talking about this. Wouldn't this just be a healthy town? Like, wouldn't this just be a good way of everyone being able to move into spaces where it had been thought about and adapted? I think you could easily map this onto neurodivergence as well, which is kind of already being done, isn't it? And you know they have certain hours that are more appropriate for people with particular needs. I know at the dentist, I can become so overstimulated and having to ask for changes to be made to the brightness or to whatever, it can be challenging, you know? And sometimes when we're already disempowered, when we've received lots and lots of messages that our value isn't important, or when we have tried to state our needs, bad things have happened to us. It becomes very, very difficult to have a voice. Which I think is why people were so keen to give us feedback around this. So that's where we got to in terms of what we heard from people. But in terms of what it could look like, I don't know. Yeah. Yes. Mm, mm, mm. Yeah. I wonder if we've been to the same one because I had that experience as well last week. I don't know. Yeah, no, I think you're right, and I think so we have invited. We tried to recruit dentists actually to the pilot, couldn't get any, but because I don't think we sold the value enough to them. But I think what's interesting about dentists is that it's the one place that many of us, just because of that innate discomfort about what's going to happen to us. Is this going to create pain? Is it going to be financially painful or physically painful? This process. I think for many of us, that's the closest we can get to the sort of feeling that people have when they're carrying a level of trauma around authority and or any sort of experience moving into mainstream services. Like you're going into something with your threat system already activated. So whatever happens once you're in there is on top of an activated threat system. So it needs to be more than the norm. It needs to be actively regulating in order to support people. So I'm glad you mentioned the dentist, Michelle. I think it's really relevant. I haven't got an example of a dentist here, but these were the sort of things that were around at the time. And I don't know if you can see on the left, this is a local hairdresser's to me, and this blew me away. And also blew away our group members when I told us about this as an example of what a trauma sensitive approach could be. Can you see that it says you can book a lady's haircut and you can book a silent cut and blow dry for people who would prefer not to talk? I shared this with our group, and they were like, "Oh my god, I've not had my hair done for years because I can't tolerate my vision in a mirror, and also the expectation that I'm going to have to stay in a chair and talk, and I can't leave." And they know they literally can, but actually, society says if you've got foils in your hair or if you're halfway through a cut, you can't just run. You can't allow your fight or flight response to support you. So this is the sort of level that we're also considering, like just basic changes to the way that we operate in order to create opportunities for people who otherwise wouldn't walk into that service. Um, Okay, I won't go any further on that because we can come back to it another time if we choose to. But I think in general, what we found from this consultation was that the themes that came up intuitively mapped on to the existing trauma informed principles. The principles around safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment and choice, and cultural, historical, and gender issues. I think within that, we tend to talk about things like control, choice, things that agency, things that people can identify with. So that was reassuring. We knew that we were kind of like aligned with where we wanted to be. But I suppose we haven't got a huge amount of time. But I wanted to give you the opportunity, in case anybody had already been thinking about or noticing things within their organisation that they thought actually that's an opportunity to enhance this here. So that sounds a bit of a grand question, doesn't it? What is your vision for your trauma responsive community, the community maybe that you'd want to live and work in too? But what if maybe does anyone have one idea already of something that you think could bring your role or bring your service just slightly more aligned to some of those principles that we talked about? Uh, yeah. Yeah. I think things like language and interpersonal approaches are so important. I've been through a similar process from an administration point of view and trying to support a staff member to be more aware of how their tone or their language might be quite triggering to people who are already sensitive to exploitation or sensitive to criticism. Very aware of the transactional nature of some of the work that we do as well. And sometimes if we are genuinely committed to becoming trauma responsive, sometimes it takes really courageous, difficult decisions to do that. And actually, as we did have to kind of address that with quite a difficult decision around staffing eventually, because the priority for us is we need to uphold our promise to our service users that we are going to treat them in a trauma sensitive way, and if we're not, that's our responsibility to do something about it. Now, I don't want to spook you and suggest that actually it's going to make huge requirements in staffing. It's not, but it's more about an awareness of how do I respond when something doesn't feel aligned. But that's a really interesting example. I'm going to move on because we haven't got a lot of time. Oh, sorry. Go on, Verity. Go, 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 go. Yeah, 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 yeah. That's a great example. It's a really good idea. So we've got a video that we put on our social media feeds that people can look at. So if they're interested in coming, or if they're coming and they're on, if they follow us, they can find this video and know what to expect. We always send a document out before they come, and it has the photo of the front door so that they know what to expect. And I think you're right. Really practical options are a really good place to start. Grace is going to talk in a minute about what that could be. I'm going to flick through these pretty quickly though. You don't really need to know the whole roadmap for the program, but this is what it looks like. As you can see, we're slightly late starting, and apologies for the delay on my part. We had a slight hiccup during my leave with a family member who ended up in hospital, so that's why we're a bit late starting. But this is the overall plan, that after this webinar we'll be thinking about booking in the sort of walkthroughs, self-reflection visits. Then there's the opportunity for a couple of workshops, and then we end it with pledges. And there is something a little bit further down the line that's a bit bigger that I want to talk to you about at the end of today as well. But in terms of what that would look like, we would start with the walkthrough, and I'm going to hand over to Grace because she's going to be doing this. I put this photo here because it always makes me laugh. It's someone from Calm Connections who they'd done their walkthrough, but then we invited them to walk round ours as a way of like critiquing us, what works, what feels aligned with the changes that you're making and what doesn't. And she was a bit cringy about having a photo taken down the stairs. So, but I'll hand over to Grace, and you can sort of briefly share what the world walkthroughs might be about. Grace, if that's all right. Oh, thank you, Grace. I've been flicking in between the kind of context and just to move to the tool to give people an idea. So it is, you probably won't be able to read that now, but if you can get an idea that it's spread across the different principles that we talked about before, that are here. And as you walk around your environment, and then afterwards, as you sit down to reflect on your processes and your leadership, the the walkthrough sort of takes you through different questions. For example, what's oh, my eyes are terrible. This is safety of the environment for clients and staff. And if we scroll down and just pick one randomly, monitoring who's coming in and out of the building. For example, people having to sign in. Whoever filled this in said, "Yeah, that's something we're doing." And the evidence is we have a register with classes and monitor who's coming in and out. But we wouldn't get people to sign in, for example, for exhibitions. It sounds like this was an arts group that did this. Um, that an example for us is that we have a controlled access door. Sometimes it's a bit of a pain when it's not working properly, but actually that was an intentional decision so that women who came to our service knew that when they walked through that door, someone couldn't follow them, or that there was a sort of regulation around who was in the building, and that was really important for some people. So a lot of it is quite environmentally focused that you can walk through. I'm going to quickly move us on because we're vastly running out of time. But this is what you can expect from the workshops. This is from our last attempt. The first one is much more focused about understanding trauma. And although I think you guys have a hell of a lot of experience already in this, and it's not trying to suggest that you don't, I think it's an opportunity to really talk about that with each other and share experiences of what that looks like, how it shows up. So it's thinking about feeling confident in your understanding of trauma and its legacy, particularly relational trauma, basically. The second one is much more kind of, and so what? Like, how do we put this understanding into action? So we start to think about how trauma informed or trauma responsive approaches could fit into the work that we do. And then the third one, which I'm really hoping that we will be able to create some funding to offer, is what I said about recognition of the potential for vicarious trauma for anyone, not just because you're doing this project, but it feels important that we recognise that there is a cost to caring. There is an emotional impact of working directly with people where their trauma sometimes is very much projected into your experience with them, and you have to manage that and carry that. So that's my hope, that we will also get an extra element of this within the funding that we've got, to be able to think about, okay, I know that I'm confident in understanding how relational trauma shows up in my work. I've made some considerations about how I might approach that now, but I also need to feel confident that I can protect myself and my staff from the sort of vicarious traumatic effect of working in this environment. And at the end of that process, we invite you to make 3 pledges. This will be an online third one where after we've done the workshops and had a little bit of space to reflect with our team about what we want to pledge. And ideally, it would be across the 3 different areas. Bye, Michelle. We'll catch up with you really soon. Of kind of buildings and environment, processes and people, and also leadership and government. But it could be anything. I think the most important thing to suggest is that this isn't a sort of hard and fast standard. It's not that actually you're making these pledges as a standard, and if any point you struggle to implement them, somehow you're not being trauma responsive. They're aspirational. They're saying these are the 3 areas in our work that we think we could use as an opportunity. But the important thing is, if people are willing, these are visible. These can be seen by the people who use your services, so they know that when they come to you, they can expect something around these 3 things. And being sort of gently held to account by our service users is actually quite important, I think. So that's the pledges. Really quickly, are we all right? Are people all right for about 5 minutes, or do people need to pop off? We're okay. All right. If anyone does need to go, feel free. I'm going to keep rattling through, and I'll revisit anyone who has to finish directly afterwards. So just thinking about why it's so important to have both a lead and a champion take part. Now, I know it might be difficult to find 2 people. It might not be. But what we found from the pilot was that we want this to be sustainable. We want this to exist maybe beyond you in your service, but we also want it to actually have some authority behind it. So someone in a policy making position needs to be part of it so that they can change and implement things around policy and things that might need authority. But also the trauma responsive champion is the person within the service who really cares about this and really holds this as an important aspect of the overall governance and of what you do. And I think those two roles together help sustain the momentum and make it much easier to embed the changes that you want to make, embed the pledges that you want to make. It also means that if one person leaves, there can be a handover to the next person that follows. So that this role that's been created, this change that has been held by people, doesn't fizzle out. Hope that makes sense. Um, what does it mean being a culture carrier? Well, I suppose it's you've been vulnerable enough and courageous enough to really lean into your processes and have a think about how you already have strength in this area, but starting to notice opportunities. I think after the walkthrough and the training, those opportunities for growth, where we can make shifts in our environment or our communication or our language, these are the things that will form the pledges. And it's not just the two folks involved, it's that lead and that champion alongside the other staff members and hopefully your service users that can start to think about how these pledges are implemented. And ideally, what we'd really like is that actually this starts to grow so that there are connections between culture carriers and we can see how we might be able to disseminate this across the broader sector. So that's what I meant in terms of an extra bit. Our hope is that if we get a core group of champions who go through this in some detail and have some time and some space to implement it, we have some funding then to do some larger scale sector-wide half days or days where we invite people to do like a condensed version of this process. So there is still, some self-reflection, there's still some learning and there's still pledges, but it's done in a slightly different way. But the reason that we felt this could be done was because you guys kind of have the knowledge and the understanding then that means we could potentially co-facilitate this together. And not just co-facilitate a day, maybe, depending on capacity, you might want to buddy up with someone who wants to do it. You might want to be their champion and support them to do this in the way that Grace and I are with you. But this is a bit further down the line. It will very much depend on capacity of people and interest. But I'm putting it out there to kind of try and demonstrate how we see this as something bigger than just us, I guess. Right, we're nearly there. That's exactly what I just said, reaching the wider community together. We'll see you soon, Addy. We'll catch up afterwards. Yeah, no worries. No worries. So I guess we're kind of moving towards the end of the session now. We can have some space separately to think about what the gains are. Like, why would it benefit you? You can see some ideas here, but I think going back and thinking together in your organisation, why would it be important for us to do this? What difference is it going to make to the people that use our services, the staff that offer it, and the position of our organisation as well? And the next steps will be to decide whether you want to move forward, to confirm who the lead is, who's in a leadership position that could take part in this, who might want to be the champion, agree a commitment. It is a bit of a commitment. There's not a lot of active time involved. The workshops are probably going to be 2.5 hours, and there's 2 of them, and maybe an hour afterwards. But it will take a commitment to embed it, to think and to plan and to consider what it might look like afterwards so that it has meaning afterwards. And when you get to a point where you decide that you want to move forward, then you can book your walkthrough with Grace at your convenience on the Google Calendar. So that's where we're at. I was hoping that we would have time to think about thoughts and questions, but I guess we did a lot of talking before, didn't we, to think about why people are here and why this might be of value to them. But for anyone who's left on the call, there's a few of us, I'm more than happy to stay for a little while and think about any questions or thoughts that you've got. It could be around some of these questions here. about the opportunity, what it might look like, any concerns or questions, or it could be something completely different. So I am aware of time and some people might just need to disappear, but does anyone have any thoughts or questions or reflections that, yeah. Mhm. Yeah. No, I'm glad you've raised it because you won't be the only person who is virtual in their offer. Grace, do you want to respond to that or shall I do it? It's completely up to you. And I think what Grace raised earlier about the idea of what you do have control over and what you don't, it's still really relevant because we go out beyond sort of this space, our Beyond Barriers office, and we go out into other organisations. So, for example, if I'm working with probation, I'm really clear about what I need in order to provide this in a way that is aligned with this. So it's kind of also recognising, even if it's not your environment, what do you need from an environment? So if say the collective was running a big service user event in Stretford Public Hall, what do you need to think about when you operate in this way to make sure service users are engaged as much as possible? I was thinking about it the other day. So it was a collective. Was it a collective one? I think it was an empowering women one in the hall, and our trauma group came. So the women came with me, and what they recognised was like the massive overwhelm. And you walk into a room and the table's already full, and you can't sit together. And so it could be things like, how do we enable people who might be overwhelmed on entry to either enter early, to request to sit together, to have an allocated table so that people connect to safe. See what I mean? It doesn't have to be your spot, it's how you approach the environment working. Does that make sense? Fab. And then the other aspects of like governance and leadership, obviously, like Grace said, will be will feel, I think, probably really relevant from a strategic perspective for you. Thanks, Nat. Any other questions? You said it sounded like you got a couple of questions. Oh, no. Okie dokie. Right. People are needing to finish, which is quite understandable because it's 29 degrees as well. If you haven't got anywhere to go to, this is probably a point to end. So, um, what our next plan is that either myself, Grace, or Odette from the collective will be contacting people afterwards to see what they want to do. We'll wait a week just because obviously people might need time to think about it with their own teams. We'll answer any questions that you've got, take any feedback. It would be really helpful if people had time to give us feedback about what they thought of the project at this point. It's worth noting that Grace is also on, as an aside, starting to think about service user feedback on the self-assessment tool and thinking about their experience of this process as well. But if there's any questions, any feedback that you want to give before that point, feel free to just email me at zoe@beyondbarriers.uk. Um, and then at that point, we'll check if you want to be involved and give you the link to sign up to the walkthroughs, and you can just pick a time slot that is suitable for you. Is that okay? Any final thoughts or questions before we finish? Oh, Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, I think revisiting values through a trauma responsive lens is a really powerful experience to do, to think about how what does that actually look like if we were doing it in a trauma sensitive way. Can be, and it's nice to have a framework to do that in, thinking about what matters to us as an organisation, what's important. Yeah, let's hope so. Let's hope so. Well, I'm really glad it felt worthwhile. As I say, any questions, get in touch. If not, we will be in touch in about a week or so to follow up and see where you're up to. All right. Lovely to see you guys. Bye.